Hello, I'm Ben Pink Dandelion. I'm part of the learning and research team at Woodbrook, and this is the third of 4 short films on the history of Quakerism. In this film, I want to look at the 19th century. This is a time where we will find different theological narratives amongst friends. In Britain, one usually following another, though always with overlap, as is the manner of these things. And in North America, though, coming into confrontation with each other and creating distinct and competing sets of yearly meetings, each claiming to be the authentic and true Quakers. So I've described the 18th century as very much focused on a kind of inward spirituality, a desire to remain faithful. We have stories, for example, of someone perhaps not ministering when feeling led to in meeting, and then perhaps ministering later in the meeting to try and make up for it, and feeling that they'd fallen short twice and being laid low in bed until feeling the forgiveness of God. This is a time of the attempt at self-annihilation, of doing away with the natural, of aspiring to the supernatural. Whilst friends are also busy out in the world, not setting up monasteries and convents, but out in the world doing business. And it's the mixing of some of these more successful, economically successful Quakers in the urban elites that allows a new sensibility to emerge amongst some friends at the beginning of the 19th century. They're very drawn by the energy and vibrancy of Methodism and of parts of Anglicanism. They've come across other Christians, worked with other Christians in the anti-slavery movements, and some friends are starting to feel rather constricted by the formulaic silence of what for some are just dead meetings for worship. Not a word spoken in Dublin meeting for 32 meetings on end. And so for these friends, something more life-giving, something more relaxed, less structured, less strictured is very appealing. And they're drawn towards an evangelical sensibility with a renewed emphasis on mission, as of course had been a hallmark of early Quakerism, and a slightly more sympathetic attitude towards the authority of Scripture, but one that at least took Scripture seriously. And this is at the same time where some of the sort of the more conservative friends, what have been called Quietist Quakers in the 18th century, were taking the idea of inward spirituality to the point where they were denying Scripture altogether. So Elias Hicks, one of the key proponents of what will become the Great Separation in the late 1820s in North America, starts to deny the divinity of Christ, the virgin birth, the resurrection, these kinds of things as not being in tune with his own spiritual experience or his understanding and interpretation of God's will. And so what we get is Quakerism diverging in 2 ways. One, particularly focused on the inward, what might be called an ultra-quietist position, and others moving in an evangelical direction. Robert Doherty has suggested this is also an urban-rural divide, that there are sociological forces at play. But the urban group, the more orthodox group in terms of Christianity, the more Bible-centered group, will reach a point where it feels that the others, in America known as the Hicksites, are really no longer Quaker. And we get these dramatic scenes where different factions are trying to place their clerks at the table of their own yearly meeting, of one group maybe locking out the other group from its meeting houses, wrestling over the minute books as almost the symbol of Quaker lineage. Who has the property? Who has the minute book? Who are the true Quakers? And eventually, in the years after 1827, yearly meetings such as Philadelphia and New York starting to have two yearly meetings, a Hicksite one and an Orthodox one, and one side disowning all the others. In parts of Philadelphia today, you will find two meeting houses on different sides of the street, one an Orthodox and one a Hicksite. So there's a division both theologically, but also of energy and of course of numbers, and sometimes also of kin. In Britain, Quakerism doesn't separate in the same way. And I think there are a couple of sociological reasons for this. One is indeed that, I mean, Britain is a small island compared with the landmass of North America. And you have a smaller group with tighter kinship ties, but also a Quakerism that in Britain is still outlawed in certain ways. Nonconformists cannot do certain things. Only in 1832 can a Quaker become a member of Parliament. And only later still will they be admitted to Oxford or Cambridge University. And only in 1871 could they work at one of those universities. So it's really only in 1871 that Quakers get full rights as citizens, along with other nonconformists in Britain. And so there's that also that kind of being bound together in opposition to dominant culture, of still seeing and feeling yourself as other in some way. And that's a strong binding force. Your energy, some of your energy is going into just trying to be Quaker in a world that doesn't give you full rights. In North America, Quakers had left the Pennsylvania Assembly in 1756 of their own volition. They'd chosen to swim upstream. They'd chosen the level and degree of political agency they wanted. And it's then not surprising that some of that energy can then get focused inwardly on trying to determine who is the truer friend. The Orthodox party, who are more centered on doctrine, on orthodoxy, will find themselves splitting again over again ideas of where authority lies. Is it in Scripture, or is it Scripture and the inward light? And we'll find a further division from the 1840s amongst that branch of Quakerism into what get called Wilburites and Gurneyites. And so in some ways we can find at least three distinct traditions of Quakerism emerging in North America in the 19th century. As I say, in Britain, what tends to happen is that evangelicalism takes over from quietism. And later still, we'll find liberalism taking over from evangelicalism. By about 1835, we can see the language of British yearly meeting, Britain yearly meeting, what was called London yearly meeting then, epistles and minutes of having an evangelical tone and language. What these evangelicals do is they want to emphasize a more confident Quakerism in some ways, a Quakerism that's prepared to go out into the world, to sit alongside other Christians. Quakerism is no longer the true church, but part of the true church, part of the Christian dispensation that God has offered humanity. And that changes quite a lot. If you're no longer the true church, you're just part of the true church, then anything that's particularly different or distinctive or peculiar, i.e. particular, about the Quaker way can then be questioned. At the start of Berkeley's Apology back in 1676, the frontispiece includes the quote from the letter to Titus about being purified under himself, a peculiar people. That desire to set yourself aside from the world, to be particular and peculiar as a vanguard for God. And with that, it's the justification and the affirmation of plain dress, plain speech, of all the things that you do and don't do as a Quaker, not celebrating the Christian calendar, of remaining silent in meeting, of experiencing communion and baptism inwardly, of foregoing a separated priesthood, of not paying tithes, which remains an issue for all nonconformists right into the middle of the 19th century. Well, as I say, if you're then just part of Christianity, all of those practices become questionable and questioned by evangelical friends. In 1850, the yearly meeting decides that it's possible to erect gravestones, previously outlawed in 1717. As long as they're all the same size and shape as everyone else's. And just name and dates, no great kind of extolling of virtues. There's still that concern about vanity, about the individual, about singularity, which becomes a difficult term for friends. You do not want to be singular. In 1859, particularly spurred on by the fall in numbers in British Quakerism, perhaps 20,000 Quakers in 1800, 13,000 members in 1860, partly due to disownment for marrying out or drunkenness or printing without permission, these kinds of things, but particularly for marrying before a priest, whether marrying a non-Quaker, which the meeting would not allow, or running off with your Quaker beloved without the parents' permission and therefore without the meeting's permission and needing to marry before a priest. It might be that the meeting would disown you for this offense, to this spiritual delinquency. You could still go to worship, but you couldn't attend business meeting and you wouldn't have any recourse to Quaker funds. And some might be readmitted after a time, showing that you were indeed still living as a Quaker, bringing up your family as Quaker. But for the evangelical friends concerned with numbers, concerned with mission, they feel that this, and now seeing other Christians as holding an equally valid spirituality, they question the practice of endogamy, that you have to marry within the movement. And in 1859, the yearly meeting decides to change its rule on endogamy and allow Quakers to marry other Christians in the meeting house. In 1861, the latter part of the fourth query is revised, the part that suggests that plain dress and plain speech should be mandatory. They're made optional. And so from 1861, it's possible to go out from meeting, not necessarily immediately visible as a Quaker, and no longer necessarily sounding as a Quaker, and go home to your Methodist spouse, perhaps. It's a huge sea change in the ways in which Quakers feel confident about remaining authentic, whilst also lowering what we might call a hedge around the movement, about doing away with peculiarity. These are Quakers who feel they can remain faithful without all those markers that their forebears had considered so essential, and who had a much different attitude to their Christian neighbours. In time, we will also see the end of elders' visits to homes to check up on the spiritual well-being of members and attenders. We will see in time a huge shift in the ways in which Quakers are part of the world's population, and the degree to which that is policed or managed through your membership with the meeting. So moving right up into the 20th century, we'll find that some Quakers today will say they felt very unsupported during personal crises. I suggest that what's happened over the last 150 years is that Quakers as meetings have increasingly withdrawn their sense of being able to discuss the whole of any Quaker's life. It's not the meeting's business anymore to know what happens outside of the meeting house. And this is a radical shift. What it means is that for those of us who are Quakers, we're left without those, without the anxiety, of course, of the unexpected elder's visit, but also without the guidance from the meeting about how we live our daily lives. We need to decide both what is and isn't Quaker, and we come out in different places on that, and also at what point, if at all, we share any of that discernment process or any of its results with the meeting. So it places us in a far greater position of responsibility, but also potentially of isolation. And that's something we may like to think about in terms of how our spiritual lives work and to whom we are accountable. So, but back in the 19th century, what we get is an increasing freedom, an increasing confidence about being able to be a Quaker in the world. Quakers start to modify the uniform and eventually dispense with it. They start to enjoy art and music and later dancing, so that in the end there becomes very little that a Quaker may or may not do. And what might be more important is the attitude with which they do it. So some things remain constant. A dedication to the opposition of war. In Britain, a continuing affirmation of the value of silent worship. But what we will find from the 1870s in North America is an increasing desire to experiment with different forms of worship, to introduce some programming, to perhaps have the worship led by a pastor, the creation of friends' churches in buildings that might not look dissimilar from other Protestant congregations. In a way, many of the Quaker hallmarks are carried on in these different traditions. We'll find that they all share, and still do, the idea of direct experience of God being primary. Though we may find different authority systems in terms of how far Scripture has primary or equal authority with the inward light. We'll find that all meetings worldwide still have a distinctive form of witness in terms of social justice and peace. And we'll still find most, if not all, Quaker meetings still have a mode of discernment in terms of how they make decisions, what in Britain we would call the Quaker business method. Meetings for worship, for church affairs. Those four characteristics are still shared across the globe. What we get with pastoral Quakerism, in a sense, is a greater degree of preparation for the moments of silence, the moments of unprogrammed worship, the moments of what some churches would call communion after the manner of friends. In a sense, those of us who just enjoy unprogrammed worship are maintaining a set of grand claims that we can somehow drop into this space of intentional connection and hopefully discover God's voice and hopefully listen. You talk to a pastor in a programmed friends church, and they say, well, yes, absolutely, but we're having the music and the message to help us prepare for that space, to come into that silence with heart and mind prepared. There is indeed less silence, and sometimes it can be filled with testimony and prayer. We like a longer silence in the unprogrammed tradition, but that too has got shorter by about half an hour a century. Right the way until the 1950s, meetings are regularly 90 minutes long. Today we'll find them an hour and sometimes less. And many of the meetings that moved online during the COVID pandemic resorted to half an hour of online worship. So we may need to reflect not only on our responsibility to define what is and isn't Quaker in our personal lives, but also to think about the nature of worship and the length of it and what we're trying to achieve. We are finding some meetings now experimenting with longer or untimed worship, and themed worship. And there are lots of different ways to worship as a Quaker. So, in the next film, we'll move into the 20th century, and I'll be speaking in particular about what's happened in the liberal tradition.